All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name's Scott Arrieta. I'm the founder and CEO of Unity and Company. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Unity is a leadership development and organizational consulting firm. And we help companies to build systems where performance and humanity can actually coexist, where leaders really understand how motivation, communication, and alignment drive results. And so we host these executive forums every month as a part of our mission to give leaders practical and research backed tools for building better organizations, not just more efficient ones, but healthier and more sustainable ones. And so today's topic is one that touches almost every organization, and yet very few actually get it right, and that's performance reviews. So now, if you've ever felt drained by your company's performance review cycle, so if you've watched weeks disappear into calibration meetings and documentation that seem to change absolutely nothing, I mean, you're not alone, because the truth that we rarely say out loud is that most performance review systems don't actually improve performance. In fact, studies show they actually often hurt performance. Harvard Business Review found that two-thirds of performance management systems fail to deliver the intended outcomes, with many actually lowering engagement and performance after the reviews are completed. And Gallup data paints an even starker picture. They say that only 14% of employees strongly agree that their performance review inspires them to improve, and just 1 in 5 feel that their manager gives meaningful and helpful feedback. So think about that. Something meant to drive growth is actually disengaging 80% of your workforce. And now, if you convert that disengagement to dollars, the lost time, the drop in motivation, the turnover that follows, you really start to begin to see the real problem. So Gallup estimates that for a 10,000 person company, the cost of traditional reviews, including wasted hours, lower productivity, and replacement costs, can reach between 2.4 and $35 million per year. So that's the invisible tax of outdated performance system. It's a tax that's paid in hours, it's paid in morale, it's paid in dollars. And so today we're going to explore three things. So, first, why your current process might be costing more than the benefit that it creates, not just financially, but culturally. And second, what's actually happening beneath the surface when feedback, ratings, and compensation are tied together. And third, we're going to explore how to fix it. What are the practical steps that organizations can take to design systems that drive accountability, growth, and trust? So, in order to do this, we'll draw on insights from the Harvard Business Review, from Gartner, from SHRM, and on lessons from our own work at Unity, helping organizations reimagine how performance and culture can actually intersect. And so, by the end of this session, I want you to walk away with a clear picture of the hidden costs of your review process and a roadmap to recover that lost value through more effective, human centered performance management. Because the real question isn't whether you have a review system, everyone does. The question is whether it's working for you or your people, or whether it's working against them. All right, so let's start by quantifying what traditional reviews actually cost, not in abstract HR terms, but in tangible business terms. So, first, there's the time cost. Most organizations drastically underestimate this. But according to research by the Corporate Executive Board, the average manager spends 210 hours a year on performance management tasks. That's over 5 full work weeks. Now, if you multiply that across hundreds or thousands of leaders, the labor cost alone runs into the millions. Now, second, there's opportunity cost, because those hours spent writing, reviewing, and calibrating are hours that are not spent coaching, innovating, or leading. And McKinsey found that companies spend up to 30% of managerial time on performance related paperwork that has little measurable effect on business outcomes. And third, there's the emotional cost. So, SHRM reports that 71% of employees view the review process as unfair, and nearly half say that they dread it more than any other work activity. So, when feedback feels arbitrary or transactional, employees disengage. And disengaged employees don't just underperform, they end up costing you money. Gallup estimates that disengaged employees cost US companies $450 to $550 billion annually in lost productivity. And fourth, there's bias cost. So MIT Sloan research shows that performance ratings account for up to 25% variance in outcomes due to managerial bias rather than actual performance. And so that means that 1 in 4 decisions about pay or promotion could be distorted, which is a recipe for legal exposure and lost trust. Which brings us to the fifth point, which is the trust cost. Because when people stop believing in the system, the best talent checks out. They either stop trying or they start leaving. And a Deloitte study found that 58% of executives believe that their performance management approach doesn't drive engagement or high performance. And those organizations are 30% more likely to face regrettable turnover. So if we add these up, the time, opportunity, morale, bias, and turnover, you're not just talking about an inefficient process. You're talking about a system that actively destroys value. And here's the kicker: most of these costs are invisible. They don't show up as a budget line. They show up in the form of slower decision cycles, inconsistent standards, and burned out managers. Now, there is some good news because every dollar lost to inefficiency is a dollar that can be reclaimed through better design by moving from a bureaucratic review cycle to a developmental feedback culture. And that's where we're heading next: what actually makes performance reviews fail to drive performance, and how you can shift from measurement to momentum. All right, so now that we've established the hidden costs, let's dig into why the conventional review model so often fails to deliver performance improvement. So we'll look at 5 core failure mechanisms, and then later we'll contrast them with more effective alternatives. So first, there's the backward-looking trap. Traditional reviews ask managers to judge what already happened, often from many months ago, when the opportunity to influence the behavior has long since passed. And it's as if you've closed the barn door after the horse has already bolted. So the HBR article, The Performance Management Revolution, calls this, quote, holding employees accountable for what they did last year at the expense of improving performance now and in the future, end quote. Many organizations are now abandoning rigid annual reviews in favor of ongoing personal development conversations because so much attention is paid to historical metrics and figures. Future focused learning rarely gets any airtime. And second is the idea of delayed correction. So when issues go unaddressed for months, poor habits, misaligned goals, confidence gaps, managers lose momentum and find it harder to shift performance. Waiting until year end to course correct is just too late. Instead of catching small issues early, they grow into entrenched problems that are harder to remediate. Third, distortion from ratings. So when you wrap feedback and development inside a rating or ranking system, a few distortions emerge. So managers inflate or compress ratings in order to avoid conflict. Employees chase what's measured rather than what actually matters. And the conversation shifts from growth to justification. And this occurs because the rating becomes the focal point, not the performance or the journey. So the corporate executive board studies suggest that the average manager spends over 200 hours per year just on review related activities, often more on dealing with the side effects of rating systems, like appeals. Now, fourth, weak follow through on development. Many development plans are generated in the review meeting, but then forgotten. So without embedded coaching or accountability, or revisit points, most action items never really come to life. The review ends, and so does the momentum. And that's why organizations are shifting toward micro checkpoints and feedback loops rather than a one and done session. Now, fifth, overload of multiple purposes. So reviews are asked to do just way too much. We're using reviews to evaluate, to develop, to decide promotions, to set pay, to flag exits, to calibrate across groups. When you stretch a single process across all those purposes, each dimension weakens. You dilute growth coaching, you politicize ratings, you force trade-offs between fairness and talent differentiation. And that multiplicity of purposes often leads to internal conflict. Do I tell someone what they need to improve or protect them against harsh rating consequences? So, taking all of these things together, these failure modes convert performance reviews from instruments of growth into bureaucratic weight. The system punishes curiosity, it stifles experimentation, and privileges defensiveness instead of actually facilitating learning. So, one of the guiding ideas behind the shift that we'll discuss later is to decouple the developmental conversation from the evaluative one. Let feedback be free of tethers to pay so the conversation stays honest and future focused. So, up next, we're going to examine the weakest link in the execution chain, which is feedback delivery, one on one meetings, and feedback frequency, and how the compensation linkage sabotages the coaching moment. All right, so now let's zoom in on feedback delivery and cadence. And this is arguably the tension point where most performance systems crack under pressure. So here again, we see a cluster of execution flaws that negate the best design intentions. So first, infrequent feedback is a fatal flaw. So annual or semi-annual feedback, it's just simply too slow in a fast-moving world. Employees don't wait 6 months to change direction. They need course correction in real time. And many organizations have adopted continuous feedback or regular check ins to reduce lag and catch issues early. In a Gartner poll, managers reported that 33% of them believe that weekly one on ones with direct reports are the most effective, while 47% favored every 2 week meetings, but only 14% preferred monthly check ins. So that means that 80% of leaders see value in more frequent touch points than once a month. Now, second, poor feedback delivery under time pressure. When managers are overworked, then feedback becomes vague, reactive, or defensive. They may even default to generic praise or criticism rather than more nuanced and actionable coaching. And that really kills credibility. Now, third, the misuse of one on ones. So, a lot of leaders treat their one on ones as status updates. So, resource reviews, project check ins, or blocker removals, but they rarely use them for developmental coaching, performance conversations, or career growth. And that's a real missed opportunity. So, Sherm outlines that effective one on ones should help clarify expectations, solicit input, and coach future performance. And so, if you only talk about performance when compensation is near, the feedback becomes transactional and really anxiety producing. All right, now fourth, cancellations and instability. So, because one on ones are often rescheduled or canceled for more urgent tasks, they erode trust. So, in one study, over 40% of one on ones were rescheduled each week, with the average reschedule taking over 10 minutes to do. So, when meetings become optional or inconsistent, employees really internalize that feedback is not important. It's not a priority, and their development stalls as a result. All right, fifth up, um, ratings. So ratings compensation linkage is a poison pill. When feedback is clearly tied to pay, both parties posture. The manager filters the critique, the employee guards vulnerability, and when a raise or bonus is looming, feedback becomes transactional, not developmental. And so this linkage warps both timing and the tone of the feedback. Because of these dynamics, even the best intentioned feedback processes collapse into compliance rituals or avoidance narratives. And what's becoming clear is that frequency matters, delivery matters, and design matters. If managers don't have adequate space, structure, or support to deliver candid and timely feedback, then the whole system falls apart. And that's why our alternative model will lean heavily on micro feedback loops, narrative coaching, and decoupling from compensation. So, in the next slides, we'll explore how we can rebuild the feedback loop, increasingly frequent and authentic, and how to free coaching from the burden of ratings. All right, now let's talk about one of the most corrosive dynamics inside of most performance systems, which is the direct tie between ratings and compensation. So, on paper, it sounds logical. You reward the best and correct the rest. But in practice, it creates a mess of incentives, bias, and mistrust that ends up costing companies millions in disengagement and turnover. So, first, let's acknowledge the intent. Linking ratings to pay was meant to reinforce accountability, right? So, to motivate higher performance by connecting it to tangible rewards. But as Harvard Business Review points out, when pay becomes the focal point, then feedback stops being developmental and then it starts being defensive. So, second, the moment that you introduce ratings, you also introduce politics. Managers know a low rating can damage morale or prompt attrition. And so, what they do is they inflate scores. In one Gartner study, 62% of managers admitted that they routinely adjusted ratings to avoid difficult conversations. So, inflation makes ratings meaningless, while compression, which is deflating the scores, erases differentiation. So you wind up with everyone rated meets expectations, but no one is really sure what that actually even means. Now, third, pay linkage changes the tone of feedback. So when money is on the line, then candor completely disappears. The employee walks into the meeting listening for a number. They're not really listening for insight. And the manager hedges language to avoid conflict. And instead of two humans exploring growth, you actually get two actors performing a negotiation. And so, as the Harvard Business Review summarized it, quote, the conversation shifts from how can I grow to how can I justify my raise, end quote. Now, fourth, it amplifies bias. So, MIT Sloan research found that performance ratings account for up to 25% variance explained by managerial bias, not actual output. And when those ratings drive compensation inequity, compounds. So, over time, under rewarded groups disengage or exit, while over rewarded groups become really complacent. Now, fifth, it encourages short termism. So, if the review determines pay this year, managers and employees alike start gaming for the near term. They chase what's measurable and safe instead of what's bold and innovative. So, McKinsey's 2020 survey on performance redesign found that organizations emphasizing yearly financial goals over learning and collaboration saw 30% lower innovation scores. So, what's the alternative? So, leading organizations from Microsoft to Adobe have started to decouple developmental feedback from pay decisions. They hold growth conversations quarterly or monthly, and they handle compensation separately through broader market and contribution reviews. So, this shift, according to a 2022 SHRM study, boosted perceived fairness by 35%, and manager employee trust rose by 40%. So the goal here isn't to eliminate differentiation, it's to remove the fear that makes feedback dishonest. And when compensation is separated, feedback becomes safe enough to be useful. Employees start asking for it rather than avoiding it. Managers focus on development and not justification. And organizations reclaim the time and emotional energy lost to endless calibration battles. So, in other words, if you want truth in your performance system, you have to take the money out of the room, or at least long enough to have a real conversation first. Even when a company has modernized its process, bias can quietly eat away at the integrity of every performance decision. So let's unpack how that happens and what it ends up costing you. So, first, bias begins with ambiguity. When evaluation criteria are fuzzy, phrases like leadership development potential or strategic mindset, managers fill in the blanks with subjective judgment. And SHRM research shows that organizations lacking clearly defined performance standards experience twice the variance in ratings between comparable employees. Second is similarity bias. So managers subconsciously reward people who think, talk, or act like them. A 2023 Harvard Business Review study found that employees rated by demographically similar supervisors scored, on average, 8% higher than peers with identical output. Now, that 8% becomes a lifetime pay and promotion gap over time. Third is gender and culture stereotypes. So, MIT Sloan's 2021 analysis revealed that women's performance reviews contain 22% more personality related words. So, things like collaborative, helpful, kind, and 40% fewer achievement related words than men's reviews. Even positive bias can backfire when it distracts from measurable outcomes. So, fourth is calibration bias. So, because calibration meetings rely on consensus, dominant voices often shape the outcomes. So, the loudest or most senior leader's opinion carries disproportionate weight. So, in many rooms, introverted or lower status managers' assessments get watered down. Now, that's not calibration, that's conformity. And fifth up is halo and horns effects. So one standout project or one mistake can color an entire year's assessment. So Gartner's 2022 performance management study found that 44% of managers admitted that a single incident influenced more than half of their rating decision. And when these biases accumulate, trust erodes fast. Employees start believing that advancement isn't tied to merit, but to politics, personality, or even luck. And when high performers lose faith in fairness, then they leave. Deloitte's Global Human Capital's Trend Report in 2021 showed that organizations perceived as having high fairness cultures enjoyed 26% higher retention and 41% greater engagement. So the good news is that bias can be mitigated, not eliminated, through design. So first, you have to make expectations visible. You need to define behaviors and metrics in advance. Second, diversify your feedback. You can use 360-degree inputs carefully for perspective, but not for judgment. And third, train your reviewers. Unconscious bias workshops reduce variance when followed by structured templates. Fourth up, audit outcomes. Monitor rating and pay distributions for disparities by gender, by race, or by tenure. And fifth up, hold leaders accountable for equity metrics just as you would for financial ones. Now, when you treat fairness as a strategic imperative, not just a side project, you protect both people and profit, because every biased review that pushes out a high performer doesn't just damage your culture, it hands your competitors a gift. Okay, so now we've spent the first half of our session exploring why traditional reviews fail. Now let's shift from problems to possibilities. What does a high impact performance system actually look like? So, based on research from Harvard Business Review, Gartner, SHRM, and our own client work here at Unity and Company, there are six pillars that separate modern performance driving systems from bureaucratic ones. So, first, make feedback continuous and lightweight. So, Adobe, their now famous move from annual check ins or annual reviews to check ins saved roughly 80,000 manager hours per year, and it cut voluntary turnover by 30%. And they didn't add more meetings, they replaced the year end event with brief, regular one on ones focused on progress and priorities. Now, the feedback itself became conversational rather than ceremonial. As Gartner notes, quote, organizations that build frequent feedback into the flow of work see 1.4 times higher employee performance, end quote. Now, second up, you need to separate evaluation from development. You need to hold two different conversations here. In one, you talk about growth, goals, and learning. And in another, you review compensation and promotion decisions. So decoupling them removes the fear that distorts honesty. Now, at Unity, we help leaders structure these as feed forward sessions. They're focused on future experiments and next steps rather than retroactive judgment. Third, you train managers as coaches and not judges. Now, Harvard Business Review reminds us that managers can't be great coaches all by themselves. They need support and structure from the organization in order to do so. Now, that means investing in the skill of coaching, asking curious questions, reflecting back patterns, and co creating solutions instead of just issuing ratings. Now, at Unity and Company, we see coaching capability as one of the strongest predictors of engagement and retention scores across our client base. And fourth up, you need to design with data, but lead with humans. So you need to use analytics to guide, but not punish. Dashboards should track inputs such as feedback frequency, development plan completion, and peer recognition, but avoid weaponizing metrics. They're thermometers, they're not thermostats. So SHRM recommends using data to spot trends in manager effectiveness rather than grade individuals. Fifth up, you need to embed culture and leadership alignment. So if senior leaders don't model receiving feedback gracefully, then the system will never take root. Now, at Microsoft, when Satya Nadella replaced performance ratings with a growth mindset philosophy, the language of feedback shifted from prove yourself to improve yourself. And the company saw record engagement and stock performance within 2 years of making that shift. Now, lastly, pilot, learn, and then scale. Don't boil the ocean. Start with a team or a division where there's energy for change. Run the new system for a quarter. Collect feedback, iterate, then expand once trust and success stories accumulate. Change management is a performance conversation too. It takes repetition and reinforcement in order to be effective. So when you put these pillars together, you get a system that creates momentum instead of monitoring. Performance becomes something that we build with people, not something that we do to them. All right, so we've talked about philosophy. So now let's talk about money. Why does fixing your performance system produce such a strong return on investment? Let's quantify what happens when you shift from a compliance model to a continuous development model. So, first is retention and turnover savings. So, organizations with regular developmental check ins see up to 15% lower turnover. And replacing an employee typically costs between 50 and 200% of their salary, depending on their level. So, for a 10,000 person company, with even a 5% reduction in turnover, the savings can easily reach 8 figures annually. Now, second up is productivity and engagement gains. So, Gallup found that teams receiving meaningful feedback at least weekly are 3.6 times more likely to be engaged. And engaged teams deliver 21% higher profitability and 17% higher productivity. So when you improve the feedback system, you're not just improving morale, you're boosting output. Third up is managerial efficiency. So, a Gartner 2021 study found that simplified continuous feedback processes cut manager time spent on reviews by up to 40%. So, if your managers spend 200 hours a year on performance documentation, reducing that by 40% is like hiring back 80 hours per manager. So across a mid-sized enterprise, that's millions of dollars in recovered capacity that can be redirected towards coaching, innovation, or customer impact. Fourth up is the quality of decision making. So when performance data becomes real time and narrative rather than once a year ratings, leaders gain a more accurate picture of talent. MIT Sloan notes that organizations using continuous performance systems see 25% greater accuracy in identifying future high potential employees. So, better data equals better succession plans, promotion decisions, and resource allocation. And finally is cultural return. So psychological safety and trust grow when feedback is regular and balanced. And Deloitte research shows that high trust cultures outperform low trust ones by a multiple of 2.5 times in innovation and speed to market. So when people believe that feedback is for their growth, not their grading, they experiment more and they self-correct faster, which is a direct driver of performance. Sixth up is the reinvestment effect. So every hour saved, every dollar recaptured can be reinvested into manager training, coaching infrastructure, and people analytics capabilities. And that's the flywheel of a well-designed system. Efficiency feeds development, which feeds results, which feeds engagement. So let's bring it to life with a simple model. So Gartner and Harvard Business Review found that managers spend roughly 210 hours per year on performance management. So that's about 5 work weeks of prep, reviews, and calibration. Now, companies that move to continuous feedback models like Adobe cut that burden by about 40%, which freed up about 80 to 100 hours per manager per year that can be redirected towards coaching and strategy. So let's imagine a company of 1,000 employees. If each manager saves 100 hours per year at an average fully loaded cost of $80 per hour, which is understating it for most industries, but let's just make it easy. So if you assume an average span of control of 10 to 1, meaning every manager has 10 direct reports, that's $800,000 of savings recaptured. Now, if improved feedback cuts attrition by just 3% at an average replacement cost of $60,000 per employee, which again is another low figure, you can save another $1.8 million per year. So that's $2.6 million in direct benefit before you even count productivity and engagement gains. So, in other words, performance reviews aren't just an HR topic, they're a financial lever. When we modernize them, we don't just get happier employees, we get a healthier P&L. And that sets us up for our next conversation because it's about what barriers you'll face as you try to modernize and how to overcome them with smart design and leadership alignment. So by now, the logic is clear. The old system is broken and the new model works. But if this were easy, then every company would have fixed it already. So let's talk honestly about the barriers that hold organizations back and what you can do about them. So, barrier number one is leadership resistance. So, when leaders came up in a system of ratings, calibration, and merit based pay, it can be really hard to imagine another way of doing things. So many believe that removing ratings will lead to chaos or entitlement, but research actually shows the opposite. Because when Deloitte replaced annual reviews with regular check ins, they found no decline in accountability and a 30% increase in real time feedback frequency. And so the fix here is start small. Run a pilot where executives can see the data. When leaders experience higher engagement and better clarity in one business unit, belief then spreads organically. Now, barrier number two is calibration anxiety. So, executives worry that removing ratings will make differentiation just impossible. Yet, what Gartner found was that calibration accuracy actually improves when managers discuss relative impact qualitatively through case based examples rather than numeric scoring. So you can maintain accountability by setting clear criteria and teaching managers to evaluate contribution instead of comparison. And barrier number three is manager overload. So let's be real. Most managers are already stretched to the max. Adding coaching and frequent check ins sounds like it's adding a lot of work, but when designed well, it actually saves time. So, after Adobe implemented its check in system, the average manager saved 17 hours per quarter previously spent on review paperwork. So the fix here is to simplify. Short, structured conversations with templates or digital nudges that take 15 minutes, not 90. Barrier number four is inconsistent capability. So even the best designed process fails if managers don't know how to coach, how to ask for feedback, or how to handle emotion. So, a 2023 SHRM study found that only 26% of managers feel confident delivering constructive feedback. That's not a policy issue. That is a skill gap in your organization. And organizations that invested in coaching and feedback training for managers saw engagement scores rise by up to 45%. So at Unity and Company, this is where we come in, building feedback literacy and emotional intelligence as core leadership competencies. All right. Now, barrier number five is culture misalignment. So, if your culture prizes perfection over learning or compliance over curiosity, then new systems will default back to old habits. So, Microsoft's transformation under Satya Nadella, which we mentioned earlier, the reason that it worked was because it was paired with a cultural reset. So, the cultural reset was all around shifting the culture from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. Changing performance management without changing mindset, it's like repainting a cracked wall. The cracks are just going to reappear over and over again. So the key takeaway here is this: every barrier is addressable through design, through leadership modeling, and skill building. But it doesn't happen by memo. It happens through consistent demonstration, reinforcement, and support. And that's exactly what we help organizations to do, to translate insight into embedded behavior. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from the hidden costs of outdated reviews to the business case for a better model. But now I want to leave you with a simple and urgent question. What is your current performance system really costing you? Because if your managers are spending hundreds of hours per year in administrative reviews that don't actually change performance, that's money left on the table. And if your talent is disengaging because feedback feels political or biased, then that's money just walking straight out the door. And if your leaders are trapped in systems that reward compliance instead of growth, then that's potential sitting idle. And the good news is this: you can fix it, and you don't have to do it alone. So at Unity and Company, we partner with organizations to reimagine how they drive performance, and we start from the inside out. So we help leaders and teams master the skills, mindsets, and systems that make performance management human centered and results driven. And our approach typically includes three layers. So, first, we start with a strategic consultation. We help you audit your current performance system, analyzing where time and money are being lost, and identifying opportunities for redesign. Now, this includes reviewing documentation, mapping pain points, and benchmarking against leading research from Gartner, HBR, and SHRM, just to name a few. Now, second up is capability building. So we don't just hand you over a new process, we develop your people. And that means hands on training for managers and coaching conversations, feedback delivery, and psychological safety, among other things. And then we equip them to hold the right conversations early, often, and effectively. And third, is sustained change and measurement. So we help you to pilot, to measure, and scale using both qualitative and quantitative metrics to track improvements in engagement, retention, and performance. And in many organizations, those shifts translate directly into millions saved and significant cultural renewal. So if this conversation has sparked ideas, here's your call to action. Audit your process. Quantify how much time and energy your reviews actually consume. Pilot a new approach in one department. Test continuous feedback and decoupled evaluation. Invest in your leader's coaching capability because the single biggest predictor of performance outcomes isn't the system, it's the quality of the conversations happening inside of it. Then measure and iterate. Track engagement, turnover, and trust, and adjust as you learn. And if you'd like a partner to guide that journey, then we'd love to talk. We've helped companies of every size redesign performance in a way that unlocks both productivity and purpose. Because at the end of the day, performance reviews aren't just about metrics, they're about meaning. They're about how people feel seen, challenged, and supported in their growth. And when you get that right, you don't just save money, you create momentum. Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like a copy of this deck or you want to discuss how to bring this work into your organization, come chat with me or reach out to our team at info@unityandcompany.com. And let's make sure that your performance systems are driving the growth that you're already paying for.